In 1962, a coal seam beneath a small Pennsylvania town caught fire. Nobody could put it out. 64 years later, it is still burning underground, and the town above it is almost entirely gone. Not from an earthquake, not from a flood, but from smoke rising out of cracks in the pavement where people used to park their cars. That is one ending. There are others. Some towns died slowly, drained by a market they never controlled. Some died in a single afternoon, when a mine flooded or a railroad changed its route. And a few never really died at all. They just emptied out and kept standing, waiting for nobody in particular. This is the story of 9 American towns that fell, and what they left behind tells you more about the country than the towns ever did while they were alive. We start in Alaska, at the edge of a glacier, in a town built by one of the most aggressive corporations in American history. Kennecott, Alaska, sits in the shadow of the Wrangell Mountains, accessible today only by a single gravel road that didn't exist for most of the town's working life. In 1900, 2 prospectors named Jack Smith and Clarence Warner spotted a strange green patch on a mountainside and assumed it was grass. It wasn't grass. It was copper, or so concentrated that some of it tested at over 70% pure copper, a number that geologists still bring up as one of the richest copper strikes ever recorded in North America. The Kennecott Mines Company, backed by the Guggenheim family and J.P. Morgan, didn't just build a mine. They built a 196-mile railroad through some of the most punishing terrain on the continent just to move the ore out. The company town that rose around the mill had a hospital, a school, a skating rink, and a population that, at its peak, hovered around 600, small by Western mining town standards, but extraordinarily self-contained, because there was nowhere else to go. For nearly 3 decades, Kennecott pulled out copper worth, by some estimates, over $200 million in early 20th century currency. Then, in 1938, the company did something almost without precedent. They didn't wait for the ore to run out. Geologists had already told them it was declining, and rather than manage a slow collapse, Kennecott's owners simply stopped. The last train left on November 1, 1938. Workers were given roughly 2 weeks' notice. Some families left dishes on the table. They assumed, reasonably, that someone would be back. Nobody came back for a long time. The mill, a 14-story wooden structure clinging to the mountainside, sat untouched for over 60 years, slowly rotting in the Alaskan weather. It is now part of Wrangell-St. Elias National Park, and the National Park Service has spent more than $30 million stabilizing it, not restoring it to working order, just keeping it from falling down. The mill still leans. The bunkhouses still stand in rows. And every winter, the same snow that buried the town in 1938 buries it again. That's one version of collapse, deliberate, fast, and corporate. The next town collapsed for the opposite reason, because the people in charge refused to stop, even after the ground told them to. Centralia, Pennsylvania, was a coal town in the Appalachian coal region, built directly on top of the seams it mined. In May of 1962, sanitation workers were burning trash in an old strip mine pit being used as the town dump, a routine, sanctioned task the borough had performed for years. This time, the fire found its way into an exposed coal seam underneath the pit. For the first several years, almost nobody outside Centralia knew. Residents would later describe noticing warm patches of ground in winter where snow refused to settle, and the smell of sulfur drifting up through basement floors. By the late 1970s, gas station owners were measuring temperatures inside underground fuel tanks that were inexplicably climbing. In 1979, a local man named John Coddington checked the gas level in his family's underground tank with a stick and a thermometer out of simple curiosity. The reading came back at 172 degrees Fahrenheit. 2 years later, in February of 1981, rising from the hole tested at carbon monoxide levels high enough to be lethal. That single incident is widely credited with forcing federal action. Congress allocated more than $42 million to relocate residents, and by the mid-1990s, the state of Pennsylvania invoked eminent domain and condemned every remaining structure in town. A handful of residents fought it in court and won the right to stay in their own homes for the rest of their lives. As of recent years, fewer than 5 people still legally reside in Centralia. The fire, by United States Bureau of Mines estimates, has enough coal left to burn for another 250 years. Most of the streets are gone now, reclaimed by grass and saplings, but you can still find a stretch of old Route 61 nearby, cracked and buckled by underground heat, covered for years in spray-painted graffiti before the state buried it under date in 2020 to stop people from visiting it. A town that fast became a federal disaster zone over heat nobody could see. The next one didn't burn. It simply got bypassed by the future. Thurmond, West Virginia, sits in a narrow gorge along the New River, a place so tight between mountain walls that the town never had room to build a single paved street wide enough for 2 cars. What it did have, starting in the early 1900s, was the most profitable train depot on the entire Chesapeake and Ohio railway line, a station that, in certain years, generated more revenue than Cincinnati's. The reason was coal, specifically the high-grade smokeless coal of a New River coalfield, prized by the U.S. Navy for fueling ships because it burned with almost no visible smoke, a real tactical advantage for warships trying not to be spotted. Thurmond had no residential zoning for vice, officially, but its sister settlement just across the river, Dunglen, ran a hotel with a poker game that reportedly never stopped for 14 straight years. Locals claimed you could walk in on any day, in any decade between 1901 and 1915, and the same hand would be in progress, just with different players. What killed Thurmond wasn't a disaster. It was diesel. As railroads converted away from coal-fired steam locomotives through the 1950s, the depot's reason for existing quietly disappeared. The coal industry that fed it declined alongside it. By the 1980s, the town's population, which had peaked near 500 in the 1920s, had fallen into the single digits. Today, Thurmond is one of the strangest hybrid sites in the national park system, owned partly by the National Park Service as part of the New River Gorge National Park, with an Amtrak stop that still technically operates, flagged down by request, serving a town with a permanent population that has, in recent counts, numbered as low as 5 people. The depot still stands, restored as a visitor center. The bank building, abandoned mid-century with its vault doors still closed, sits exactly as it was left. Some towns die because the world moves on without them. Others die because the world they served simply disappears entirely. Glen Rio sits split across the Texas and New Mexico border, exactly on the state line, which for decades was its entire business model. Built in 1903 as a railroad stop, the town discovered its real purpose in the 1930s and 40s when Route 66 ran directly through it. Because Texas was dry and New Mexico wasn't, Glen Rio's bars clustered on the New Mexico side of the line while its motels and diners spread across both, and travelers driving the mother road in either direction would stop, gas up, eat, and sometimes cross an invisible boundary in the middle of a parking lot just to legally buy a drink. For about 3 decades, that quirk of state liquor law combined with America's single most famous highway turned Glen Rio into a genuine destination. Then, in 1973, Interstate 40 was completed and routed a few miles south. The bypass took less than a single construction season. Within a few years, the diners closed. The motels, with their hand-painted neon signs, simply stopped renting rooms because nobody was driving past anymore. What makes Glen Rio unusual today is its preservation through sheer abandonment. There was no fire, no flood, no federal buyout, just a slow, silent emptying. The old First in Texas, a Last in Texas motel sign and its New Mexico mirror still stand on either side of the state line, rusting in place, and the National Park Service added the remaining buildings to the National Register of Historic Places in 2006 specifically because almost nothing about them had been altered since the interstate opened. Nobody bothered to update Glen Rio. They just left. Texas built an empire on highways. The next ghost town was built on something far more fragile. A single body buried inside a mountain that already had a body count before the first miner arrived. Independence, Colorado, sits above 10,900 feet on the slopes near Aspen, making it one of the highest elevation settlements ever permanently inhabited in North America. Gold was discovered there on July 4, 1879, which is the entire reason the town carries its name. Within a few years, it had over 500 residents, a post office, and several boarding houses clustered along a single street wedged between 2 mountain faces. What undid Independence wasn't a mine collapse or market crash. It was simple geography. Winters at that elevation routinely buried the town under snowdrifts exceeding 20 feet, cutting off the single wagon road in and out for months at a stretch. In the winter of 1899, after a brutal season of avalanches and dwindling ore, the remaining residents made a decision that has become local legend. Rather than wait out the snow, they tore apart their own cabins, lashed the lumber into makeshift skis and sleds, and used the salvage wood to literally ski and slide themselves 16 miles down the mountain to Aspen, abandoning the town entirely in a single coordinated exodus. The buildings that couldn't be carried away are still there, leaning against the mountainside above what is now Aspen's Independence Pass Highway, maintained today by the Aspen Historical Society as one of the only ghost towns in Colorado you can visit by simply pulling off a paved road at over 12,000 feet of elevation just below it. A town that left on its own terms, on its own skis. Not every town got to choose. Gilman, Colorado, perched on a cliffside above the Eagle River, was built around a zinc, lead, and silver mine that the Eagle Mine Company operated for nearly a century, through 2 world wars and a Great Depression that barely slowed it down. At its height, Gilman held close to 1,000 residents in a town so narrow it had to be built in vertical tiers along the cliff face, with houses stacked above each other like a man-made terrace. The mine didn't run out of ore. It ran out of legal standing. In 1984, decades of mining waste had contaminated the groundwater and the Eagle River below with heavy metals at concentrations the Environmental Protection Agency would later classify as severe enough to warrant Superfund designation, one of the most expensive environmental cleanup classifications in the country. The state of Colorado ordered the mine closed virtually overnight. Workers were told to leave their tools where they stood. Residents were given an evacuation order with almost no notice, and entire households walked out, leaving furniture, appliances, and in several documented cases, full place settings on dining tables, exactly the way Kennecott's miners had walked away from theirs in Alaska, half a century earlier and 2,000 miles south. For nearly 40 years afterward, Gilman sat fenced off entirely, too contaminated for visitors, monitored by environmental crews running ongoing remediation. It has only recently begun reopening in stages as cleanup efforts near completion, a slow second act for a town that was forced to leave everything behind in a single day. Some towns left because the ore ran out. Gilman left because what they'd been pulling out of the ground for a century had quietly poisoned the river underneath them, and nobody noticed until it was too late to keep living there. And then there is the town that didn't die from any of this. Not fire, not poison, not a bypass highway, not an exodus on skis. It died because the federal government wanted the land back and gave its residents 3 weeks to prove they had any right to keep it. Elkhorn, Tennessee, began as a logging camp inside the Great Smoky Mountains, then transformed in the 1910s into a private resort community for wealthy families from Knoxville, who built dozens of rustic vacation cottages along the Little River. When the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was established in 1934, the federal government needed the land Elkhorn sat on. But rather than evict residents immediately, it offered many of them lifetime leases, allowing the original cottage owners to keep using their summer homes until they died, after which the cottages would revert fully to the Park Service. What nobody fully accounted for was how long that would take. The last lifetime lease in Elkhorn didn't expire until 1992, and even then, several families fought to extend their stay further, citing the cottage's historical character. The Park Service spent the better part of the next 2 decades debating whether to demolish the structures entirely or preserve them, while the empty cottages sat decaying in the humid mountain air, porches collapsing, paint peeling off cedar shingles built for a different century. In the 2000s, the National Park Service finally settled on a hybrid solution: tear down most of the cottages, but fully restore a select few as a historical district open to hikers passing through. Today, visitors walking the trail past Elkhorn find a strange juxtaposition: perfectly restored 1920s cabins standing a few hundred feet from concrete foundations where identical cabins were bulldozed, both equally part of the same vanished community, treated by the same government 2 entirely different ways. 9 towns, 9 separate ways the country built something and then, for reasons ranging from a corporate balance sheet in Alaska to a burning trash pit in Pennsylvania, simply let it go. None of them were destroyed in the way disaster movies suggest. No single dramatic moment erased any of them. They eroded, were evacuated, were quietly bypassed, or in Centralia's case, are still actively, slowly being consumed as you watch this. What's strange isn't that these towns died. Almost every town built on a single industry eventually does. What's strange is how much of them is still standing: leaning mills in Alaska, rusted motel signs straddling a state border, a dining vault left open mid-transaction on a Colorado cliffside, preserved not by intention, but by the simple fact that once people leave fast enough, there's nobody left to tear anything down. Coal still burns under Centralia right now, with no end date anyone can give you. Somewhere above Aspen, the lumber from cabins torn apart in 1899 is still scattered against a mountainside nobody bothered to clear. And in Alaska, a 14-story mill that should have collapsed decades ago is still leaning into the wind, held up by nothing but the cold, waiting for a return that was promised in 1938 and never came. That's the real inheritance these towns left behind. Not gold, not copper, not silver. Just the unsettling evidence of how quickly a place built to last forever can be abandoned in under a month, and how long the empty version of it can go on standing after everyone who built it is gone. Thanks for watching till the end. See you in next video, and also consider subscribing to our channel. Thank you.